Her heart pounded in her chest as she made the decision. With a single command, the timeline shifted. The world around them rippled, the station dissolving into a blur of light and sound as the timeline reconfigured itself. Leora felt herself being pulled through time once again, her mind struggling to keep up with the chaos of the transition. And then, just as suddenly, it was over. Leora opened her eyes, blinking against the harsh light. She was no longer on the space station. She was back in her lab, the familiar hum of the stabilizer filling the room. But something was different. The air felt lighter. The tension that had hung over her like a dark cloud for so long now lifted. Cassian was beside her, his eyes wide with disbelief. "We did it," Leora looked around, her heart racing. "Did we?" Astra's voice chimed in, her tone calm and steady. "Temporal scans indicate that the timeline has stabilized. The Chronos Sith was never created," Leora exhaled, her shoulders sagging with relief. "We did it, but..." As the reality of their success sank in, Leora couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. The future had been changed, but at what cost? And what had become of the future that Cassian had come from? Before she could ask, Cassian turned to her, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of sadness and hope. "I don't know what's going to happen now. My timeline, it's gone." Erased, Leora's breath caught in her throat. "But you're still here," Cassian smiled faintly, his hand reaching out to brush a strand of hair from her face. "I guess some things are meant to be for a moment." They stood in silence, the weight of the timeline shift settling over them. Leora felt the tears welling in her eyes, a bittersweet ache filling her chest. They had saved the future, but what did that mean for them? "I don't want to lose you," she whispered, her voice trembling. Cassian's gaze softened, and he stepped closer, pulling her into his arms. "You won't. Time can't erase what we have." The hum of the stabilizer faded into the background as Leora stood motionless in her lab. Her eyes locked onto the holographic screen that displayed the newly stabilized timeline. The data scrolling across it confirmed Astra's analysis. The future had changed. The Chronos Sith, the weapon that had torn the timeline apart, no longer existed. The authorities' control was gone, wiped away like a bad dream. But the sense of relief that should have followed was nowhere to be found. Instead, there was only a deep, unsettling silence, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Cassian stood beside her, staring at the same screen, but his gaze was distant, his mind lost in thought. His timeline was gone, erased by their intervention. The future he had come from, the battles he had fought, the friends he had lost, all of it was now undone, replaced by an uncertain new reality. And yet, despite it all, he was still here, standing in the present, tethered to a world that no longer belonged to him. "I should feel," something Leora said quietly, breaking the silence. "Relief, maybe, or joy. We did what we set out to do. We saved the future. But it doesn't feel right." Cassian's voice was soft, almost hollow. "Because something's missing." Leora turned to him, searching his face for answers. His usually guarded expression had softened, but there was a deep sadness in his eyes, a sadness that mirrored her own. "We changed the timeline," he continued, his gaze distant. "We saved billions of lives. But the future I knew is gone. The people I fought for, the ones I tried to protect, they don't exist anymore. Not like I remember them. It's as if they've been erased, and yet I'm still here." His words hit her like a punch to the chest. She had been so focused on the science, on preventing the catastrophic future, that she hadn't fully considered the human cost of their actions. The version of Cassian standing before her wasn't just a man out of time, he was a man without a past. A man whose very existence was now an anomaly. Leora swallowed hard, the weight of her own guilt settling heavily on her shoulders. "I'm so sorry, Cassian. I didn't think about what it would mean for you." He shook his head, his expression softening as he turned to face her. "Don't apologize. You did what you had to do, and I knew the risks. I came back to stop the future from falling apart, and we did that. We saved them, but at what cost?" Leora whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't want to lose you in the process." Cassian's eyes met hers, and for a moment the distance between them seemed to shrink. "You haven't lost me, Leora," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'm still here." He reached out, gently taking her hand in his. His touch was warm, grounding her in the present even as the uncertainty of the future loomed large. The connection between them was undeniable, stronger now than it had ever been. But even as their bond deepened, Leora couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the timeline they had fought so hard to protect was still fragile, still at risk. As if on cue, Astra's voice interrupted the moment, her usual sarcasm replaced by a tone of urgency. "Leora, I've been running a deeper scan of the new timeline, and there's something you need to see." Leora frowned, pulling her hand away from Cassian's as she turned to the holographic display. "What is it?" Astra. The screen flickered, and a complex web of data and temporal coordinates appeared. At first glance, everything seemed normal. The timeline was stable. The catastrophic future had been averted. But as Leora examined the data more closely, a sense of dread crept over her. "There's a temporal anomaly," Astra explained, her voice tense. "It's small, but it's growing. Something is destabilizing the timeline. Cassian's eyes narrowed. What kind of anomaly? Astra hesitated, her orb flickering in and out of focus as she processed the information. It appears to be a divergence point, a fracture in the timeline, and it's connected to you. Leora's heart skipped a beat. Me? How is that possible? I'm not entirely sure, Astra admitted, but it seems that your decision to change the timeline, to stop the chronosith, created an unintended ripple effect. The timeline is trying to correct itself, but something is preventing it from fully stabilizing. If this anomaly grows, it could tear the timeline apart again. Leora's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what Astra was saying. They had succeeded in stopping the chronosith, but in doing so, they had unknowingly created a new threat, one that could undo everything they had fought for. What do we do? She asked, her voice tight with panic. We need to trace the anomaly back to its source, Astra said. If we can figure out what's causing it, we might be able to stop it before it gets worse. But you need to hurry. The longer the anomaly persists, the more unstable the timeline becomes. Leora nodded, her hands trembling as she pulled up the data on the anomaly. Her gaze flickered to Cassian, who was watching her with a mix of concern and determination. We'll figure this out, he said, his voice steady. We've come too far to let the timeline fall apart now. Leora wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that they could fix this. But deep down, she knew that the anomaly wasn't just a random glitch in the timeline. It was something more, something personal. And as much as she didn't want to admit it, she couldn't shake the feeling that Dr. Rune was somehow involved. The drive to Dr. Rune's lab was silent, the weight of the situation hanging heavily between them. Leora's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and emotions. She had always trusted Dr. Rune, had looked up to her as a mentor and a guide in the complex world of quantum mechanics. But now, everything felt uncertain. There were too many unanswered questions, too many secrets that had been kept hidden for too long. When they arrived at the sleek, silver building, Leora hesitated for a moment before stepping out of the car. Cassian was right beside her, his presence reassuring, but she could sense his wariness. He had never fully trusted Dr. Rune, and now Leora was starting to understand why. They entered the lab, and the familiar hum of machinery greeted them. Dr. Rune was standing by one of the consoles, her back turned to them, but she seemed to sense their presence. Leora, she said without turning around. I've been expecting you. Leora's heart skipped a beat. You knew we'd be coming. Dr. Rune turned slowly, her sharp eyes locking onto Leora's. Of course. You've created a temporal anomaly, and it's only a matter of time before it spirals out of control. Leora's breath caught in her throat. How do you know about the anomaly? Dr. Rune's expression softened, but there was something unreadable in her gaze. Because I've been monitoring it. I've been monitoring everything, Leora, ever since you started your time manipulation research. I've been keeping an eye on the timeline. I had to. Leora's stomach churned. What are you talking about? Dr. Rune sighed and stepped closer, her tone soft but firm. There's so much you don't know, Leora, so much I've tried to protect you from, but it's time you understood the truth. The anomaly isn't a mistake. It's a consequence of the choices you've made, choices that were never yours to make. Leora's pulse quickened. What do you mean? Dr. Rune's gaze darkened, her eyes filled with an emotion Leora couldn't quite place. You were never meant to alter the timeline. Leora, your research, your work with time manipulation, it was always meant to serve a greater purpose. But you've deviated from that path. And now the timeline is unraveling. Leora shook her head, her heart racing. I don't understand. What greater purpose? Dr. Rune stepped even closer, her voice low and urgent. You weren't the first to discover time manipulation, Leora. I was. Decades ago. I've been working in secret, trying to guide the timeline, to shape it into something stable, something that would prevent the collapse of reality. But when you made your breakthrough, everything changed. You disrupted the balance. And now we're on the brink of catastrophe. Leora's mind reeled, her thoughts spiraling out of control. You've been manipulating the timeline this whole time. Dr. Rune nodded slowly. I've been trying to fix it. But now, with the anomaly growing, we're out of time. If we don't act now, everything will be lost. Cassian stepped forward, his voice hard. And what exactly do you propose we do? Dr. Rune's eyes flicked to Cassian, and for a brief moment, something like recognition flashed across her face. We have to undo the changes you made. We have to let the timeline play out as it was originally meant to. Leora felt her heart drop. You want me to let the future, the dystopian future, happen? Dr. Rune's expression was cold, calculating. There are some sacrifices that must be made for the greater good. The timeline must be preserved. If we don't, the anomaly will tear everything apart. Leora stared at her mentor, her mind racing. Everything she had believed, everything she had worked for, was crumbling before her eyes. The person she had trusted most had been manipulating her all along, guiding her research toward an end she hadn't even known existed. I won't do it, Leora said, her voice shaking but resolute. I won't let that future happen. Dr. Rune's expression hardened. Then you do must. All the tension in the room was palpable, the weight of the decision pressing down on all of them. Leora's heart raced as she tried to process everything: Dr. Rune's deception, the growing anomaly, the threat of the future falling apart. She didn't know what to do, didn't know who to trust. But as she looked at Cassian, his steady gaze holding hers, she knew one thing for certain. They had to find another way. The lab was silent as Leora and Cassian left, the weight of Dr. Rune's words heavy on their minds. The future was hanging by a thread, and the timeline was unraveling faster than they could keep up. "We can't let her do this," Leora said, her voice tight with emotion. "We have to stop her." Cassian nodded, his jaw clenched. "We will. But we're running out of time." Leora took a deep breath, trying to steady her thoughts. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with danger and impossible choices. But one thing was clear: they were at the point of no return. Whatever happened next would determine the fate of the future and their place in it. The sky above the city was streaked with crimson as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, twisted shadows over the towering skyline. Leora stood on the rooftop of her lab, staring out at the vast expanse of the megacity below. The world looked peaceful from up here, as if it were untouched by the chaos brewing just beneath the surface. But Leora knew better. The timeline was fraying, and reality itself was on the verge of collapse. Cassian stood beside her, silent but watchful. His presence was steady, grounding her in the moment despite the storm of emotions and fears swirling inside her. They had been through so much together, fought to save the future, forged a bond that went deeper than either of them could have imagined. And now, as they stood on the brink of the unknown, that bond felt like the only thing keeping Leora from falling apart. "We need to make a decision," Cassian said quietly, his voice breaking the silence. "The anomaly's getting worse." "We don't have much time," Leora nodded, her throat tight. "I know, but I still don't understand how we can fix it without undoing everything we've done." Cassian's gaze flicked toward the city, his eyes dark with worry. "I don't know if we can fix it, but we have to try. We can't let Dr. Rune reset the timeline. Not after everything we've been through." Leora clenched her fists, her mind racing as she thought back to Dr. Rune's ultimatum. Undo the changes they had made, let the dystopian future happen, or risk letting the anomaly tear the timeline apart. It was an impossible choice, and every path seemed to lead to destruction. "There has to be another way," Leora said, her voice shaking with desperation. "We've come too far to let it all end like this." Cassian turned to her, his expression softening as he reached out to gently touch her arm. "We'll find a way." Together, his words, simple as they were, wrapped around her like a lifeline. Leora had spent so many years alone, isolated in her work, convinced that love and connection were distractions she couldn't afford. But Cassian had shown her that love wasn't a weakness. It was a source of strength, something that had carried them through every obstacle they'd faced. She looked into his eyes, seeing not just the man from a future that no longer existed, but someone who had fought for a better world, someone who believed in her. Together, she whispered, her voice barely audible. For a moment, they stood there in silence, the weight of the world pressing down on them. But in that silence, Leora felt a spark of determination ignite within her. She couldn't give up, not now. There had to be a way to save the future without destroying the present. "We need to stop Dr. Rune," she said, her voice steady now. "If she resets the timeline, everything we've done will be erased. But we also need to stabilize the anomaly before it gets worse." Cassian nodded, his gaze sharp with resolve. "We'll confront her, but we'll need to be smart about it. She's not going to give up control easily." Leora exhaled, her mind already calculating the steps they needed to take. Dr. Rune had the advantage of years of experience with time manipulation. She was more dangerous than Leora had ever realized. But Leora had something Dr. Rune didn't: Cassian. Together they had a chance. "Astra," Leora said, turning to the AI, who floated beside her, glowing softly in the twilight. "We need to track Dr. Rune's movements. Can you access her systems?" Astra flickered for a moment before responding. "Already on it. She's in her personal lab, preparing the equipment to reset the timeline. I've also detected an increase in energy output from her stabilizer. It looks like she's getting ready to make her move." Leora's stomach twisted. They didn't have much time. "Let's go," Cassian said, his voice firm. "This ends tonight." The drive to Dr. Rune's facility was tense, the air between Leora and Cassian heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. They didn't speak much, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was a shared understanding, a quiet resolve. Both of them knew that this final confrontation would determine everything: the future of time, the fate of the world, and their place within it. When they arrived at the sleek, silver building that housed Dr. Rune's secret lab, the sun had set completely, and the night sky was filled with stars. The facility loomed before them, silent and imposing, its smooth metallic walls reflecting the faint light of the city. Leora and Cassian exchanged a glance before stepping inside, their footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. There was a stillness to the place, a kind of eerie calm that set Leora on edge. Dr. Rune was here, somewhere, preparing to enact her plan. As they approached the main lab, the doors slid open with a hiss, revealing the sleek, high-tech interior where Dr. Rune stood waiting. She was at the central console, her back to them, her hands moving swiftly over the controls. The hum of the stabilizer filled the room, its energy pulsing in time with the rhythm of the anomaly Leora could feel deep in her bones. "You're too late," Dr. Rune said without turning around, her voice cold and emotionless. "The reset is already in motion." Leora's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped forward, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "You don't have to do this, Evelyn." We can find another way. Dr. Rune turned slowly, her expression calm but her eyes sharp with determination. There is no other way? Leora, the timeline is broken, and the anomaly is growing. If we don't reset the timeline now, everything will fall apart. Cassian stepped forward, his voice hard. You're not fixing anything. You're trying to control the timeline for your own purposes. Dr. Rune's gaze flicked to Cassian, her lips curling into a faint smile. You're from a timeline that no longer exists, Cassian. You're an anomaly yourself. You don't belong here. Leora felt a surge of anger at Dr. Rune's cold dismissal. That's not true. He belongs here just as much as any of us. Dr. Rune's expression hardened. You're both blind. The timeline has been fractured beyond repair. The only way to fix it is to reset everything, to undo the changes you made, to restore the timeline to its original course. Leora shook her head, her heart racing. No, I won't let you erase everything we've done. There has to be another way. Dr. Rune's eyes softened for a moment, but there was a deep sadness in her gaze. There's always a cost. Leora, I've been trying to protect the timeline for decades, but sometimes sacrifices must be made. I wish it didn't have to be this way. But we're out of time. Leora's mind raced as she tried to think of a solution, some way to stabilize the anomaly without resetting the timeline. She glanced at Cassian, his steady presence giving her the strength to keep fighting. There's another option, Leora said suddenly, her voice trembling with the weight of what she was about to propose. What if we stabilize the anomaly by anchoring it to something or someone that's outside the normal flow of time? Dr. Rune frowned, her eyes narrowing. What are you suggesting? Leora took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. Cassian. He's already an anomaly. He exists outside the timeline as it is now. If we anchor the anomaly to him, we might be able to stabilize it without resetting everything. Cassian's eyes widened in surprise, and he opened his mouth to protest. But Leora continued before he could speak. I know it's risky, but it's the only way. We can't let the timeline reset, and we can't let the anomaly grow. If we anchor it to Cassian, we can save the future without destroying the present. Dr. Rune's expression darkened, her eyes flicking between Leora and Cassian. That's a dangerous gamble. Leora, you're playing with forces you don't fully understand. I understand enough, Leora said, her voice firm. And I'm willing to take the risk. Cassian stepped forward, his gaze intense as he looked at Leora. Leora, you don't have to do this. There has to be another way. Leora shook her head, her eyes filled with determination. No, Cassian. This is the only way. You've always fought for the future, for a better world. And now you can be the key to saving it. For a long moment, Cassian said nothing. His gaze locked onto hers. The air between them was thick with unspoken emotions, with the weight of the decision they were about to make. Finally, he nodded, his voice soft but resolute. All right, let's do it. Dr. Rune watched them with a mixture of wariness and something like admiration. You're both fools, she said quietly. But maybe you're right. Leora moved to the console, her fingers trembling as she input the necessary calculations. The stabilizer's energy output began to shift, redirecting toward the anomaly. Cassian stood beside her, silent but steady, as the process began. Astra's voice chimed in, her tone unusually somber. I'm ready to anchor the anomaly to Cassian's temporal signature. But once we do this, there's no turning back. Leora nodded, her heart pounding. Do it. There was a flash of light, and for a moment time itself seemed to ripple around them. Leora felt the pull of the anomaly, the twisting sensation of reality bending, but through it all, she could feel Cassian's presence steady, unyielding. And then just as suddenly it was over. The lab fell silent, the hum of the stabilizer fading as the energy dissipated. Leora blinked, her vision adjusting to the dim light. The anomaly was gone, stabilized. The timeline, fragile as it was, had been preserved. Cassian stood beside her, his expression calm but weary. He reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. You did it, he said softly. Leora felt a tear slip down her cheek as she looked up at him. We did it. Dr. Rune watched them from across the lab, her expression unreadable. The timeline is stable, she said quietly, but you've created a new anomaly. Cassian's presence here, it's not natural. He's no longer tied to any future, to any past. He's untethered. Leora's heart clenched at the weight of Dr. Rune's words. Cassian had given up everything, his future, his past, to help save the timeline. And now he was an anomaly, a man out of time with no place in the world. But as Leora looked into his eyes, she knew one thing for certain: they had each other. And no matter what the future held, they would face it together. Days passed, and the world returned to its normal rhythm, unaware of the events that had transpired in the shadows of time. The anomaly was gone, and the timeline had been preserved, but Leora and Cassian knew that their journey was far from over. They stood on the rooftop of Leora's lab, the city sprawling out beneath them, the stars twinkling in the night sky. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Leora felt a sense of peace. Cassian stood beside her, his hand resting gently on hers. What happens now? He asked quietly. Leora smiled faintly, her gaze drifting to the stars. We move forward. Together. Cassian nodded, his grip on her hand tightening. No matter what, as the stars above them twinkled and the night stretched on, Leora knew that their story was far from over. Time might be fragile and the future uncertain, but as long as they were together, they could face whatever came next. And in that moment, under the vast expanse of the night sky, Leora realized that love like time was infinite. It transcended the boundaries of space, the limitations of the past, and the uncertainties of the future. It was a force that could bend time itself, that could anchor them to each other even when the world around them shifted. Together they would face whatever the future held, because love, like the stars, was timeless,